The time period from 1816 to 1824 was called the Era of Good Feelings. So this name first came from a Boston newspaper in 1817, but it really sums up what this time felt like for those who lived in the United States. So just by looking at these dates, we can see that this was the time that came right after the end of the War of 1812. So after the Treaty of Ghent was signed, and after this huge decisive victory at the Battle of New Orleans, there was this feeling of patriotism, of being really proud of the country that you lived in. So this feeling of nationalism that these citizens of the United States had, they felt very connected. They felt at peace politically. They felt like there was finally harmony with foreign affairs between not only just them and Britain, but across the world. They felt like there was this new feeling of peace. And they were becoming the United States that we're going to see today. So they're really going to find their identity during this time through the presidency of James Monroe and through all of the things that come along with this time period, such as legislation, Supreme Court decisions, and adding to the United States and really moving forward as an industrial nation. So this era of good feelings is definitely a step forward for the United States. Henry Clay is a name that we talked about when we talked about the Warhawks and the reason for the War of 1812 starting, but he's also really prevalent and important in the era of good feelings, which is after the War of 1812. And his ideas were so important because they really shaped the way United States acted as a country during this time period. And his ideas put together were called the American system. So this American system had three goals, and all of these goals had the same central theme, and that was that they wanted to unify all the states of the United States with a national system of trade and transportation. And he thought that all of these things tied together would make sure that the United States economy was on the up and up and that money would be flowing and everything would be good economically. So let's break down these three goals. So the first goal was that there would be a strong central bank for the United States. So by doing this, it would allow for new businesses to take out loans, and it would also provide credit to farmers and merchants. And this would really jumpstart the economy and give it some stability, because at this time, all of the states were really operating independently when it came to their banks, and this was making for a really shaky economic situation, and their money was pretty much all over the place. So his first goal was this strong central bank. His second goal was to raise tariffs on foreign goods. So he thought by doing this, this would protect Americans' industries from competition, and this would also raise the price for you to be able to buy things from other countries, which would make the products in the United States more profit, and it would also create more jobs, which would stimulate the economy for those in the United States. So basically, he wanted to give less credit to the products from other countries and really shine a light on the United States industry, making a more industrial nation and making a better economy. His third goal was to make improvements on transportation systems that would connect the states and to also work on the internal issues in the states. And he wanted the federal government to have a part in that because prior to this, each state really took care of their own internal issues and the government stayed out of it. And he thought that by having these internal improvements and transportation systems connecting the states, this would help things like trade in the United States, and it would connect the West to the East and have the United States really work together as a nation rather than work in little pieces. So you're going to see that these three ideas and three goals that Henry Clay had really ended up panning out and changing the way the United States was as a nation. So you can see this when the United States created the Second Bank of the United States in 1816. This was a really shaky thing because the first few years of this second bank caused a lot of issues that would lead to conflicts that we'll talk about later on in this PowerPoint. But it wasn't perfect, but it definitely gave some sort of stability with the money situation and the economic situation in the United States after everything got settled. The South might disagree with this a little bit because it messed farmers up in the South and in parts of the West, but this really benefited the North a lot because they were more industrial and needed this bank. So the bank was good and bad in certain areas. This also created the Tariff of 1816, which would really do exactly what Henry Clay wanted it to do because it would raise the tariff on goods coming in from other countries and generate the wealth within the country and within trade within the country. And lastly, he had a really hard time enforcing his last goal because the federal government really did believe, as well as the states believed, that the states should take care of their issues in their own state and they should make improvements on their own state themselves. But you're going to see that there were improvements being made during this time, such as the Erie Canal, which was funded entirely by New York State. But you're going to see that there were new transportation systems happening that were creating this feeling of being connected as a country rather than each state working independently. And this is going to jumpstart the economy, jumpstart trade in the United States, and allow the United States to become a more independent nation and not need other nations to be successful. So I know that was a mouthful, and this is a lot about Henry Clay and the American system, but these ideas were really the basis for the way the American economy operated during the era of good feelings. Erie Canal was a huge deal during this era of good feelings because it completely changed the way trading happened in the United States, and it essentially connected the East and the West and helped the economy to really boom during this time. So the Erie Canal was an idea by a man named DeWitt Clinton, who was the governor of New York at this time, and he was really looked at as being kind of crazy for making this idea because it was such a revolutionary, huge idea that it just seemed impossible. But ultimately, something like this needed to be done because trade was becoming too difficult in the United States. And trade was difficult in the United States prior to this canal because there was little transportation, and the transportation they did have was not efficiently getting goods from one side of the country to the next. And also the geography in the United States made it really difficult for trade to go over things such as the Appalachian Mountains and go from the east to the west and back. So they needed to find a way to basically open up the heartland of the United States and make it so they could transport goods back and forth and trade. And this idea was the Erie Canal. And the Erie Canal is a man-made river in upstate New York that would basically link the Hudson River in New York to the Great Lakes in the West. And this would open up the country and allow them to trade easier and faster and more efficiently. And that it did exactly that. So the economy took off after this. You're going to see that the economy is boosted, money is pouring into the United States, and it's finally allowing the East and the West to come together as a nation rather than working apart because they were separated from this inability to travel back and forth and trade easy. So this canal took around $7 million to make, and it was made between the years 1817 to 1825. And if we think about how big of a deal this was for the economy, it really wasn't a lot of time or a lot of money to make something that had this much of an impact. And by having this Erie Canal, you're going to see that the transport of goods is cheaper, it's faster. It's always been cheaper and faster to travel on the water, but now you have the ability to travel such a huge distance and bring things back and forth so much easier. And this is really going to help the economy take off. And I know I've said that a lot, but it's really important to realize this Erie Canal is the reason for this huge economic boost during this time. And on top of it connecting both sides of the country, it really industrialized the North even more. So you're going to see that at this point, the North is way more industrialized than the South. But with this Erie Canal, there's going to be huge cities that pop up around the canal in New York, such as Buffalo, Syracuse, and Rochester. And it's going to put New York on this path that we see today as being one of the biggest cities in the world. So it's definitely going to industrialize the country more, and it's going to connect the country more and make it this powerhouse on the world stage. Just like the Rush-Bagot Treaty, the Convention of 1818 was really useful in that it kept the peace between the United States and Britain. And it did just that really perfectly because this Treaty of 1818 resolved a lot of questions that could have caused conflict down the road between Britain and the United States. So in 1818 in Philadelphia, Britain and the United States got together to discuss where the border was out west, the border that would separate British Canada from the United States. And this Convention of 1818 led to the Treaty of 1818, which would formally establish what land goes to who and where the cutoff is. So this treaty said that the 49th parallel, which you can see in the picture on the slide, that line right there, that would decide definitely where the border is out west that would separate British Canada from the United States. This would also establish the fact that the Oregon Territory that you see in green would be split between the U.S. And British Canada. So the United States would get access to that land in the Oregon Territory. And most importantly, by doing this, it would keep the peace between Britain and the United States and even start a friendship that we still have with them today. So although we talked a lot about issues that were resolved between the United States and Britain, there were still issues that needed to be resolved between the United States and Spain at this time. So during this time period, Spain still had a lot of land in North America, and a good example of that is Florida. And this land that was owned by Spain in Florida was causing a lot of issues in the United States, particularly in Georgia. Because in Florida, there was a lot of escaped slaves and Seminole Indians, and these Seminole Indians were attacking and raiding the Georgia territory that was part of the United States. So as a result of this, James Monroe, as the president, was going to send General Andrew Jackson, who we know a lot about already because of the Battle of New Orleans. He was going to be sent in 1817 to basically go down to this Spanish territory of Florida and to stop the Seminole Indian raids that were happening and that were affecting the United States. But Jackson, being the type of war hero he is, would not just take this lightly. And he was going to go against what the president sent him there to do, and he was going to capture forts in Spanish Florida, and he was really going to flex his muscles there and show Spain what the United States was all about at this time and how much of a superpower they were. And because of this, Spain, being the weakened country they were, because they were stuck in wars with France at this time, decided that they didn't want a war with the United States and that the United States didn't want a war with Spain. And ultimately, they decided that they were going to give Florida up to the United States. And this really was decided on paper during this Adams-Onis Treaty, which happened between the United States and Spain. So these two nations got together to discuss this treaty, and as a result of this treaty, Florida would go to the United States, and the boundaries would be set between these two nations. And a big boundary that was decided was the boundary between Louisiana and Texas. So we would see that everything above that boundary line would really be the United States territory, and Texas would still not be part of the United States. So if you look at that picture, you can see that that line right there would really decide what goes to the United States and what does not yet go to the United States. And that land, obviously Florida, that is striped, that goes from Spain to the United States. So this was a really positive thing, and this showed how the United States was really becoming this powerful nation and gaining more land and expanding as a country. The 1819 Supreme Court case, McCulloch v. Maryland, came from issues that stemmed from the federal bank being introduced to the states in the United States. So let's just break this down a little bit farther. So as we talked about previously, the United States decided that they were going to get the second bank of the United States up and running. And this bank was going to represent the entire country rather than these tiny little banks spread across the states individually. So the federal bank decided they were going to open a branch in Maryland, and the state of Maryland was really not happy about this because a lot of states felt like the United States should not have the constitutional right to open a bank that represented the entire United States and the entire federal government. So in order to fight back, the state of Maryland tried to impose a $15,000 annual tax on this bank, and James McCulloch, who was the cashier of the bank, this federal bank that opened in Maryland, decided that he wasn't going to pay this, and this was ridiculous. So he refused to pay this, and the state of Maryland reacted to this by sending this issue to court. And ultimately, this court decision went all the way up to the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court, and huge decisions and huge results came out of this. So the decision that came out of this from John Marshall was that Maryland could not tax the federal bank. And also the decision was that it was constitutional for the federal government to make the banks. And the states basically had to respect this and not try and tax the banks. And this had an underlying meaning that really held true throughout history after this point. And that was the Supremacy Clause and federalism. So the Supremacy Clause really goes over the fact that the federal government has this superiority and this power over the state rights. And this really shows in this decision because the states were not allowed to tax something that came from the federal government, such as this bank. And this shows federalism, which is really the balance of power between the federal government and the states, because this showed that the federal government had this extra power, that they were able to create this bank and that they could not be taxed by the states. So although this decision dealt with something as simple as a cashier not wanting to pay a tax, it really had some ripple effects in the government of the United States. So just by looking at the results of the election of 1820, it's really obvious how the United States felt about James Monroe during the era of good feelings. So clearly the United States loved James Monroe because this was such a landslide victory in his favor. So James Monroe went up against John Quincy Adams, and like I said before, at this point, Democratic Republican Party is pretty much the only political party in the United States at this point. So no one really wanted to run against James Monroe because, like I said, we're at the height of the era of good feeling. People love him. Although there were issues such as the Panic of 1819 and the issues between the slave states and the free states, people still love him and think he's a great leader. So he wins all electoral votes except for one guy named William Plumer in New Hampshire who voted against him. But overall, this was a landslide victory, and he's going to serve another term as President of the United States during this era of good feelings. Okay, so when we look at the Monroe Doctrine, it's really important to understand that during James Monroe's second presidential term, he's more focused outward. So during his first presidential term, he's really focused on things happening inside of the United States. But as he's reelected as president for a second term, he's going to focus on more foreign policy, especially with the continent of Europe. So before we talk about what the Monroe Doctrine did, let's first talk about why it was even needed in the first place. So during this time, Portugal and Spain are really on the decline on the world stage. So they're eventually going to lose their land and their territories in the Western Hemisphere. And the United States doesn't like this idea because they know that other more powerful European nations like Britain and Spain are going to try and snatch up that land in the Western Hemisphere, particularly in like the Latin America area. And they're scared that this is going to affect the balance of power, and this is going to affect the United States directly. So James Monroe gets together with his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, and they released this Monroe Doctrine in 1823. And this covers two really important points. And this is going to be a really essential document throughout history, so it's really important that we pay attention to what these 2 points are. So the first goal of this doctrine is to let Europe know that the New World is no longer going to be subject to colonization by European nations. So overall, this means that the Western Hemisphere is off limits to Europe. So you can't come over here and colonize these lands. You can't insert your influence into the Western Hemisphere and the Americas anymore. So this is a huge point of the Monroe Doctrine. Also, the doctrine is saying that the United States is going to remain neutral regarding issues on the European continent. So as we've seen throughout history, Europe always seems to be in conflict. Whether it's Britain and France or whoever else, there's always seeming to be wars, and the United States seems to be dragged into them way too much. So Monroe is basically saying that this is no longer going to be an issue because the United States is going to stay neutral in all of these conflicts. And these are two really important points that are going to affect U.S. history moving forward. You're going to see that the Monroe Doctrine is used for a very long time after this regarding issues that happen with the United States and Latin America. So this is definitely important during Monroe's presidency, but also really important moving forward, and it really shapes the United States as a nation.